So we can probably move on to our next speaker. Is going to be Dennis Pennington. He comes to us from Michigan, and he's here to tell us about the Great Lakes Yen Enhancement Program. Dennis is the wheat extension specialist at MSU, has been employed for 25 years there. Dennis received both his Bachelor and Master of Science degree in the Crop and Soil Sciences Department from Michigan State University. His current research program includes the Wheat State Variety Performance Trials, Precision Planting, High Yield Management Program, and of course the Great Lakes Yen. Dennis is committed to excellence and strives to fulfill the mission by bringing science-based information and knowledge to all our critical needs and issues. Welcome, Dennis.
All right, good morning, everybody. How are you doing today? Good. You like this warm spring we're having? So back home, we don't have any snow on the ground anymore, and we've been extremely warm compared to normal. We had less than half the amount of snowfall we normally do in the season, so it was good to come here and actually see a few little snowbanks where they'd push snow off the parking lots. But anyway, so yeah, my name's Dennis Pennington, a wheat extension specialist at Michigan State University. I have the privilege and pleasure of working with a great team of people with the Great Lakes Yield Enhancement Network. I was able last night to participate in the Yen Awards program that you had here, and that was a great program. So what I thought I would do, I'll share some information about things that we're learning from our Great Lakes Yen program, and then I'll sprinkle a little bit of research data from some research projects that we think are helping our growers to push those yields a little bit higher. So I would love to have questions and comments. If I put something up there you don't understand or you think I'm wrong, raise your hand or just holler at me. I would say throw a water bottle, but we don't have water bottles. Don't throw a water glass at me. So please, let's have this as a discussion if at all possible. So are there any burning questions before I get started, though? Anything about wheat you want to know? No? What's the price this fall? I'll look into my crystal ball and I'll let you know. And then we'll just make a deal on the side on what that's worth. I have no idea what's going to happen to the price. Globally, we have, for 4 years in a row, we have used more wheat than we've produced, so we've drawn that stock down. But that is coming off from 5 years ago having record global stock of wheat. So we're digging into that stockpile now. At some point, there's got to be some news event or some weather event somewhere globally that's going to trigger a market response. But I just don't know when that'll be or how much that will be. So, any other questions? All right, well, let's get started. How much wheat can be grown on a per acre basis? What are the records? Well, this is a list of some of the record wheat yields from across the globe. I got the wrong one here. This is the pointer. So you can see some pretty high yields here, going all the way down to 7.2 tons, and this is metric tons per acre. So hopefully this is in the right units for you folks here. We use bushels per acre back home. But 7.2, that's a really big yield. So can we get that yield in this climate, in this region where we are? Well, so these record yields, where are we getting those record yields at? Where in the world? Where do you think we're getting these record yields at? There's two big primary countries where this is coming from. Where are they? Yep, and so they're at farther north latitudes and farther south latitudes, which means they probably have a cooler climate than the latitudes in between, right? So that's an important part of maybe extending the growing season and having a longer grain fill period so that they're able to get those higher yields. So where are we at here? This is some data from our 2023 yen. These three growers here are our top three from this past year. Jeff Cook, oops, and I did that again. Jeff Cook from London, Ontario had 4.7 tons per acre. Nick Suin was just a little bit behind him with 4.6, and then Jeff Crone at 4.5 tons per acre. So we're not up at that 7.2, which is what the world record was. And I heard that there's a yen grower in the UK in 23 that set a new record yield, but it's not official yet. So, you know, we've got a long ways to go before we're ever going to be able to meet some of those yields. Now, this other in green here, these three, we do percent of yield potential, which you guys reported last night in your yen as well. And so we had a guy actually achieve 117% of his yield potential. We were very, very dry, and I think the way that he achieved that was he had root system that was able to go deep enough in the soil profile and pull moisture deeper than what we would normally expect. And then we had Jeff Crone hit 107, and so did Wallace Lowen. Now, Wallace Lowen had a little bit lower yield at 3.5 tons, but that's still a pretty decent yield. And he achieved 107% of his yield potential. So that's kind of where we are in the Great Lakes at this moment. We started this project in 2021 with 43 fields. That grew to 98 fields in 22, and then 156 this last year. And right now, for going into 24, we're sitting at 202 fields. So we've had a considerable amount of growth in the program. And you can see on the map the geographic distribution here. Ontario and Michigan are the primary areas where we are, but notice we've got grower in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and down there's a group of them in Kentucky. We're getting some in Missouri, and clear all the way out here in the Pacific Northwest as well. There's interest in this program. And we're also talking with folks in Manitoba about starting a yen program, and they might work with us using some of our infrastructure and kind of data management as well. So the interest in the yen program seems to be growing, and I think from what I heard last night, it's growing here as well. But it's a great program because farmers are teaching farmers how to grow better wheat. And we have a national wheat yield contest in the U.S., and sometimes people that participate in that are getting these really high yields, they don't want to share what they're doing on their farm. This is their secret, it's their advantage, their competitive advantage over everybody else. What's unique about this yen program is these growers are willing to share what they're doing. If you're in the program, they will tell you, this is what I did, this is what I found, or I tried this product in the past and it didn't work for me. And so that's what I like about this yen program, is it's growers that are communicating with each other to share this information back and forth. So a little bit of background, we do not grow any spring wheat. We grow only winter wheat in our region. We grow soft red, soft white, and a little bit of hard red. So maybe a little bit different than your area. 99% of the wheat we produce is milling quality. We have 5 mills in Michigan that mill a big chunk of the wheat that we produce. We only have feed wheat if we have a quality problem. In this last year in 23, we did have some poor falling numbers, which caused some feed wheat. And nobody wants to have feed wheat in our area because that automatically lowers the value of the crop. So they always strive to have milling quality wheat. So the range in grain protein from all of our 23 participants, those 156 farms, was between 6.8 and 13.5. That's quite a big range. There's also a big range in the amount of nitrogen that's being applied. In terms of soils, the soil organic matter ranges from 1.5 to 6, so we have quite a range of soils. Soil pH ranges from 5.6 to 8. And our average annual rainfall is about 820 millimeters of water. I don't know how that compares to your average annual rainfall here. We were well under our average last year. In fact, we were about half of our average. And we actually calculate whether a farm was water limited each year. And almost half, about 48% of the farms in our yen program last year were water limited, meaning their yield would have been higher had we had more water. And those that had the heavier soil types had the higher yields. And guys were telling me, and the yield monitor and the combine, when they're going across the field, in a field that's variable soil types, they saw 30 bushels per acre and 130, which would be, half a ton and maybe 3 tons or 2.7 tons or something like that. Per acre. So wide range, and the soil type was very important this last year in terms of yield potential because it was so dry. We do percent sand, silt, and clay because we use that to determine, or in our crop modeling. So on average, about 38% sand, 36% silt, 26% clay, but you can see on here, we had some farms that had really high clay content. So you got to manage those really high clay soils a little bit differently, like in terms of seeding rate and things like that. But this just gives you a little bit of perspective of kind of the range in growers and farms that we have. Yeah, good question. How deep would the soils be? We generally have very deep soil profiles. You get down in Kentucky and that will shallow up a little bit. So in the southern part of our region, it'll shallow some, but we're generally, well over 2 meters, 3 meters. And there's not rock down there in most of the northern places. You got to get, way deep to get to that. You're in parent material before you hit rock. So. All right, so first thing, selecting a variety is one of the first decisions that you make that will impact your yield potential, isn't it? We have about 42 different varieties. I couldn't fit them all on the screen here, so this is the top 20 in terms of yield. I didn't get them all converted into tons per acre, so this is listed as bushels, but 144 bushels is about 3.9 tons, and it goes down to 3.4 tons per acre. So I'm not trying to sell varieties here, but variety selection is important. More evidence of that, this is the average spikelets per head in this left column here, and you can see there's a range in the size of the heads that these put out. And then the same with harvest index, from 0.51 down to 0.43. So variety selection is important, and you've got to pick varieties that perform well on your farm, the way you manage it, and so on. So there's not one variety that's always going to be the winner. If it was, we'd have one variety of wheat to plant, right? Because seed companies would only sell their top variety. Well, they don't do that. So selecting the right variety is very important. The vast majority of our participants are no-till. 70% of the farms use no-till practices, and then we got about 10% in each of the different categories of conventional, minimum, and conservation tillage. Previous crop, by far the most common is soybean as a previous crop. Here it's probably potatoes. Is that the most common previous crop? Yeah, so we grow a little bit of wheat after potatoes in Michigan. But we don't actually have any of those growers in our yen program here yet. And we do grow some dry beans as well. And actually the dry bean crop, our growers that grow dry beans and then follow wheat after that tend to have a little bit higher yields for a couple of reasons. The dry beans tend to mineralize a little more nitrogen. Plus, dry beans are generally harvested about 2 weeks earlier than soybeans, which allows them to plant their wheat more on time. And that's a big factor. When the season's getting late, you got rains preventing you from planting or harvest, and you're trying to get the crop in. We don't have a lot of farms that are applying manure in this, so I suspect this might be a big difference between our group and your yen group here, but these are the numbers. Now, what about splits? How many times do we go across the field? We track every time somebody goes to the field. If there is nitrogen in as a product when they go across the field, we count that as a pass. So if there's nitrogen in the starter, it counts as a pass. So the most common is 3 passes with 55 of the farms doing that. Second most common is 2 passes. So generally this would be some nitrogen in the fall in starter and then 1 pass of nitrogen in the spring. But we also have some farms that are really trying to push the envelope here. This one out here at 7 applications was an irrigated farm. We had one farm that's irrigated, and he put a little bit of nitrogen on every time that center pivot ran. And as dry as it was, he made 7 passes this year, which is more than normal. Normally he puts on 2 or 3 passes with a center pivot, and that's enough rainfall. But we were very, very dry. In terms of nutrients added versus nutrients removed, these green bars are the average nitrogen application rate. So we're putting on an average of 142 pounds of N. We are removing 95 pounds of N. In terms of phosphorus, we're adding 41, removing 18. For potassium, adding 41, removing 22. And then sulfur is another important nutrient. Our average application is 23, and we're removing 7. If you look at this grain plus straw, so those of you that are removing straw, notice these nutrient numbers are a little bit higher at 118, 21, and then notice if we're removing straw, notice our potassium becomes a little bit of a deficit. So we need to pay attention to that. Make sure you're putting on enough potassium if you're baling straw off. Was there a question? No. Okay. So what about nitrogen fertilizer products? We put this together just because I wanted to illustrate what are the most people using. Because people will ask me, what's the right source of nitrogen to use? Well, nitrogen is nitrogen. It really doesn't matter what fertilizer product it is. There are things about each product that work well in different situations. So it's a matter of figuring out what is the right combination of things for you, whether it's dry or liquid, and so on. So why do you think this almost 54% of all of the nitrogen put on in our YEN program was UAN, 28%? Why do you think that is? What's the reason that they are choosing this over these other products? Convenience of application and uniform distribution. That's key. How many of you have seen a wheat field with strips in it because the fertilizer spreader didn't do a good job of uniformly spreading the fertilizer? We see that every year. I see that driving down the road. I can find fields that I know there was a problem with the fertilizer spreader. And so they're choosing to use it because it's more convenient, and they get a good uniform distribution of the nitrogen fertilizer. So we talked a little bit about last night. We compare this top and bottom 20% of the farms, and what we do is we just sort the farms yield from high to low, and then we take the top 20% of those, and 20% of 156 would be about 31 farms. So there's 31 farms in the top group, and then we take the 31 farms in the bottom group, and we just average those 31 farms together, and then we make comparisons for a number of different things. So our average yield on these differs 3.98 versus 2.54, so pretty significant difference. Look at total biomass, 7.31 versus 4.61 tons. A lot more biomass. You're not going to get a high yield crop if you don't produce high biomass. There's just no two ways around it. So when you're thinking about how do I manage this crop, you need to think about things that I can do on the farm to improve my biomass. Get the rows closed earlier in the spring, get it up, get it growing earlier, get it capturing sunlight earlier, because biomass is your solar factory, right? That's the biomass is what collects sunlight energy and converts it to energy that the plant uses for growth and development and then creating grain yield. Harvest index was a little bit different, not big, 52%, and if harvest index is the ratio of grain to total above ground biomass, so, of course, you want a higher percent. You want as much of that. If you're going to produce a 7.31 ton above ground biomass, you want as much of it to be grain as possible. If you're producing just a bunch of vegetation and not converting it to grain, that doesn't do you much good unless you're baling straw. And then our yield potential, that's our theoretical maximum yield potential, was calculated, and that average for the top 20 was 4.9 versus 4.04. And then the percent of yield potential, the average attained, the high yield group is getting 80% of their yield potential, but they still got 20% to go, don't they? Okay, so they still have room. They're getting some really good yields. We set a record yield this year in our program, the highest yield we've had in all 3 years, but there still is potential to go higher. So total biomass is one of the key things. We're going to come back to that in a couple minutes. So a couple of other things. Let's look at some yield components. We measure spikelets. Not a big difference. One more spikelet, so that's not a big thing. But look at the heads per meter squared, 870 versus 553. And then, so if you take the number of spikelets, or actually the seeds per head, and that really wasn't that different, 32 versus 31, but you take that number times that number, and you get the number of grains per meter squared. That's where your yield is coming from. So in terms of yield components, and then I've got 1,000 kernel weight, and then I also put in here the seeding rate, because you might be thinking, well, if in order to get this high number of heads per meter squared, this high head density, boy, I got to jack my seeding rate up. I got to plant way more seed, right? Well, that is not what we're finding, okay? The guys that are getting the higher yields are actually planting less, but they're doing it on a different row spacing, so I'll get into that. That's another part of the equation. So heads per meter squared is one of the big driving factors that you need to be paying attention to on your farm in terms of, tracking, am I making progress on my farm towards getting higher yields sustainably year after year. So in the heads per meter squared, this is 2022 data as well as the 23 combined here. The difference between those high yield groups, it's 60% and 57% in these 2 years. So consistently we see this heads per meter squared as being a very important component of this. So we talked a bit about biomass. So this next chart will show us the relationship between grain yield and biomass. So what we're finding that as grain yield goes up, so does biomass. So if we're having trouble growing biomass, you're going to suffer on yield. So this is 2021. Remember, we had 43 farms in 2021, and that was what the relationship looked like. This is 2022, and this is 2023. So biomass is a key factor in producing a high yield. You've got to have high biomass crops. That means you've got to get your crop planted on time. You've got to have adequate moisture. You've got to have adequate nutrients. You can't have disease problems. If you have soil compaction that's keeping the roots from penetrating in the soil, that's going to be a problem. That will limit your biomass. So this is a really important thing. So because biomass is such an important factor, we started evaluating, okay, what do we know about biomass and what are the management factors that impact the total amount of biomass? So we started a research project trying to characterize biomass and get a better understanding. In some original research we found we're noticing a difference in the response of these droopy canopy types versus these erect. So Eric Olson is our wheat breeder. He developed this scoring system, and it's from 1 to 5. It's not complicated. 1 being droopy, 5 being erect. And what it is it's this tiller angle here. Notice with these droopy types, those rows fill in and you really can't see the row, where with these erect types, you can clearly see the row. Now, how is this going to impact sunlight penetration into this canopy? Which one's going to allow light further down into the canopy? The erect, yes. Is that good or is that bad? Do we want that or do we not want that? Okay, we don't want that, and what we don't want is we don't want light to hit the soil here. We want light to hit plant material. So is there something we can do with these erect canopy types that can affect that? And we have what we call a conventional management versus high management program, where the conventional management, we plant at the same seeding rates with same herbicide, and the only thing the conventional management gets is 90 units of N in the spring, nothing else. The high management gets that plus a second pass with 30 more units of N plus 2 fungicides and sulfur. What we're finding is that these erect canopy types respond more to that higher management than these droopy types do. So depending on your management system, if you have the time and the ability to manage higher for higher yields, you definitely want this erect canopy type compared to this canopy type. So we're still learning. We don't have all the answers here yet. But the other thing that we think will impact this is if we look at different row spacings. Almost all of our wheat in the Great Lakes area is planted on 7.5-inch row spacing. So is that similar to what you are here? Yeah. So here's just some pictures of some different varieties with different canopy scores. Notice on these top varieties here, you really can't make out the row compared to these bottom ones. You can clearly see the rows in these. And this is just pictures taken from our variety testing program. So we've got a bunch to learn on this yet, but I think there's something to be, I think we're going to be able to improve our management with variety selection if we can learn a little bit more about how the biomass grows and develops. Now, we took some canopy temperatures of the different canopies. So This is just pictures from 3 different varieties. This is the canopy score, so the 1 is the very floppy, you can't make out rows. Here you can sort of make out the row, but here you can clearly see each of these rows in there. And the image has the summary of the different temperatures in here, but it's hard to read, so I'll just put that down at the bottom. Which one has, well, do you want a warm canopy or a cool canopy? You want cool canopy, yes, definitely. If you have a warm spot in your canopy, that's an indication that there's a stress on the plant. It could be disease, it could be water stress, it could be a weed problem, it could be insect pests, but a warm canopy means there's a problem with it. So which one of these has the lowest average temperature? The droopy one, doesn't it? Okay. So, but notice in this one where the canopy temperature is average is 25.1, where is the warm spots? It's the soil, right? Reflecting the light back. So if we change row spacing and close this gap a little bit, can we impact that? That's where we're headed next with the research. So we talked about creating biomass. One of the things that's most important is planting on time. So we set out to do a planting date and seeding rate study. We did 5 different planting dates, and we started September 15th and basically went every 2 weeks in the calendar until November 15th. And then we also did seeding rates from very low, 0.8 million seeds per acre, all the way up to 2.4 million seeds per acre. So the idea is to try to identify, we've traditionally had our extension recommendations have always been the later in the season you go, you want to jack up your seeding rate because you're not getting tillering in the fall, right? Well, what is that real number? If you're getting to mid-October or getting into 1st of November, when you get that late, how much should you jack it up? What is the right number? So that's why we did this study. And so you can see the different passes. Every 18 feet, there's a different seeding rate here. You can't really tell that in these pictures, but we mow out alleys in these prior to harvest. But every 18 feet, there's a different seeding rate. And you can see the different planting dates. The planting date 1 is over here along the edge. That's the tallest. And then planting date 3, planting date 4 here, 5, and then planting date 2. In the back, this lighter colored is barley. We did the same study on barley as well. So this is why it is so important. These are plants from each of the planting dates, and I dug these plants on December 11th. So by then, we're at the end of the growing season. We're not going to get much more growth and development in the fall, okay? So which of these plants do you think is going to have the highest yield potential? Probably the one on the left, right? Or maybe the second one. So these are the dates, the planting dates, but notice the big difference between October 1 and October 15th. That's only a 2-week difference. How many tillers are on this plant? None, right? Is that what you want? No. How many tillers would you like to have on your wheat in the fall before it goes dormant? Ideally, you want 2 to 3, okay? So here you've got, you got your main stem and you got 1, 2, 3 tillers there. Here, that's going to be even a little hard to count. There's probably 6 tillers there. But just going in what seemingly a 2-week period doesn't seem like that big of a window. You know, if I'm planning October 1 versus October 15th, well, you know, it's only 2 weeks. It can't make that much difference. Well, it really does. Now these dates, these calendar dates, I don't know how these line up for you folks as far as when you need to plant, but this phenology here definitely applies to you. You need to plant early enough so that you can get this. This is your ideal plant right here. That's what you want to see in the fall before you go into dormancy. So whatever that date is, and that will vary from year to year depending on the fall season that you have, but that's where you want to be. So here's the data. So on this axis, I've got yield, followed by, on the bottom axis here, it goes from seeding rate from 0.8 up to 2.4. So here's planting date 1. Okay, those are what your yields are. How much of a response to higher seeding rate did we see? How steep is that curve? Did we see a big response? Nope. Okay, here's planting date 2. How much of a seeding rate response do we have? Well, not much. There's planting date 3. There's 2 things to notice about this gray line. Now, this is the October 15th. What are the 2 things to notice about this line? Pardon? It's lower yield, so the yield potential is automatically lower. And notice that was the one that didn't have any tillers in the fall, right? Okay, so how important are those fall tillers? It's showing up right here, and it's pretty flat, isn't it? So even going kind of mid-season, we didn't see a big response from increasing the seeding rate. That's planting date 4. What's happening to our yield potential? It's just dropping right off, right? So does increasing the seeding rate, and there's planting date 5. So we are seeing a bit of a seeding rate response in that late planting date, but can we just jack up our seeding rate and fix a late planting? Are we ever going to get back to our yield potential that we had up here? No. So the next slide, I will show you we were trying to hit targets. We want targets so we can tell growers the agronomically optimum seeding rate for this planting date is this seeding rate. So what we did is we said for each of these planting dates, what is the seeding rate that achieves 97% of the yield potential of that planting date? Now remember, planting date 1 and 2 are your highest. In planting date 5, 97% of that will never yield the same as 97%. So let me just show you what those numbers are. So, and this does follow, we do need to increase our seeding rate the later in the season we go, but we will never ever get back the yield potential we've lost because we've planted later. And we've looked at management studies. So if we plant this late timing, if we increase seeding rate and we do extra splits on nitrogen, we add some sulfur, we do some fungicide, we can never manage our way back to the yield potential that we would have had if we'd planted on time. So planting on time is very, very important. And so what about some yen data? This is 23 data, and this is the Julian date. Day 271 is like September 27th or 8th, I think. This year, there was only 6 days difference between that top 20% and the bottom 20%. Last year, this number was 11. There was 11 days difference. So planting date's very important. And then here's that seeding rate information again. So maybe you're scratching your head, how come we're seeing low seeding rates producing higher yield and higher number of heads per meter squared? Start thinking about tillering. We're going to get into that. So these are plants that we dug from the high seeding rate to 2.4 million seeds. This was a plant dug from the 1.6 million seeding rate, and this was a plant dug from the 800,000 seeds per acre, or 0.8 million. So if you're trying to choose what seeding rate, what do you want on your farm? Do you want more plants on the left, or do you want less plants on the right? What's going to be best for you? Well, it kind of depends, right? There's a lot of factors that impact your germination, the variety you're planting, your management, how many nitrogen applications, can you get planted on time? A lot of things impact this, right? But if you're not doing some seeding rate tests on your farm, you probably should be. And I wouldn't just automatically drop clear way down to that 800,000. Our third place this year planted 900,000 seeds per acre and it was 167 bushels, which is like 4.5 or 4.4 tons per acre. Huge yield with very low seeding rate, but it's because he was able to get that crop to tiller for him. So what about row spacing? So we did some work on, actually there was more than just row spacing with this. We did a precision planter. I got the wild-haired idea that, well, if we can singulate seed in corn and soybeans, why can't we singulate seed and get exact uniform distribution in a row and uniform spacing, and that ought to help make wheat yields be really high. What I found is that wheat seed is so small and we plant at such high populations, there's no way a vacuum plate planter can spin that disc fast enough to drop the seed. And when you do hit the targets, that thing is the seed disc is making a revolution about every second. And I was it's a 120 hole seed disc that I used. So in 1 second, we're dropping 120 seeds. And we're traveling at, 4 mile an hour. So how uniform do you think that is? It's just, basically the technology is just not there yet to singulate seed. So that was one of the objectives of this study. But we learned something that I wasn't quite expecting to find. We built this planter to do different row spacings. So we did 5-inch, 7.5, 10, and 15-inch row spacing, and this is what the yields were. So we got the highest yield on our narrow row spacing. This is kind of the standard, this one here, the 7.5-inch. That's what most people are doing. And part of the reasons for doing this study is I had growers come to me saying, I need to replace my drill, but I also need a soybean planter. Can I buy one machine and plant both crops with it? Well, they're wanting to move away. They don't want to plant 7.5-inch row soybeans. They would prefer to go to 15-inch row soybeans. So that was the reason for doing these different row spacings. So going between 7.5 and 10, not a big difference. But the difference between 5 and 7.5 is 11% yield increase, only 3% between 7.5 and 10, but it was a 16% when you widen that row spacing out to 15. So the answer for growers that are wanting to use one machine is if you can plant your soybeans with a 10-inch row spacing, that you're not going to lose much on your yield on wheat, but if you go to 15, you are. And so going between a 5 and a 10 is a 14% difference in yield and 30% yield between the 5. So because of this, we have actually 2 of our top 3 winners in the yield this year, or in the end this year, are planting on 5-inch row spacing. And so that's something that's a little bit different. And how does that impact tillering? We've talked a little bit about that. How does that impact total biomass? These guys that are winning, they have just huge amounts of biomass. Their biomass numbers are off the charts. And then the seeding rate component of this, and this was done before that seeding rate and planting date study, and this is what really kind of showed me that, maybe we're planting more seeds than we need to because the yields were not statistically different. These 3 all have A's. Numerically, they're a little bit different, but they weren't statistically different. So 1 million seeds per acre was the same as 1.5, same as 2 from a statistical standpoint, but 500,000 just wasn't quite enough seeds per acre in this study. So that was the reason, this study is the reason why we did the planting date and seeding rate study, which came actually after that. So a little bit more about the yen. I get people asking me about, what about fungicide applications? How important is that? And we were very, very dry this year during the grain fill period, and very dry at anthesis, which is when we get infection from Fusarium head blight, right? So I had growers say, it's been so dry, I'm going to skip my fungicide application at T3 because I don't think we're going to need it. I'm not going to have a vomitoxin problem. But when you split your nitrogen and you combine that with a fungicide, you don't just get the benefit from the added nitrogen and the added fungicide. There's a synergistic effect that gives you some additional increase in yield by doing both of those practices in tandem. So we have growers are doing all different combinations of practices, and the one that's the most common is this T1 followed by T3 fungicide application. 51 farms are doing that. 42 farms are doing only the T3. So notice the green bars here are farms that are only doing a single application of fungicide. The blue ones represent more than one. So, and notice I have down here, we had 17 farms that did not apply a fungicide. There's the average yields. Which one had the lowest average yield? No fungicide, right? So down here at 2.7, that's the lowest of all these yields. Now you got to remember, this isn't a research study. This isn't replicated trial data. This is just reporting what happened on 156 farms in 2023. Okay, so keep that in mind. But for the people that maybe aren't necessarily a believer in fungicide, this data has convinced them, combined with other management, there can be some benefit there. So environmental factors, we track these. SWHC is soil water holding capacity, so soil texture plays a role in here. In fact, we use, our USDA has a soil plant available water model that you plug in percent sand, silt, clay, and organic matter, and it will estimate how much water is in that profile available to the crop. And then we assume when the crop greens up in the spring, our soil profile is full. So we assume that water that's in the soil profile is available to the crop, and then we add how much rainfall they got to get the total amount of available water, which is TAW. In our crop modeling, we use the total amount of biomass that they produced and multiply that by 18 millimeters of water per metric ton of biomass per hectare is the unit, to estimate how much water they used based on what the size of their crop was. And this is what we found, between the top and the bottom 20%. And if you look at this, the top growers, the top 20%, used 96% of the available water. The bottom group only used 72% of the available water. That is critical in a year when we were as dry as what we were. Now, I think last year you had rain and dryness was not a problem for you, but I imagine there's probably years when you do have dry conditions during your grain fill period. So other things, solar radiation is another thing we track. We actually had higher solar radiation in 23 compared to 22 and 21 in the yen this past year. And I had people tell me, oh, the Canadian wildfires and the smoke, we had haze, and they said that decreased our yields, it delayed maturity of our soybeans, and all these other things going on. And the fact of the matter was there just wasn't a difference. So we measure incident solar radiation intercepted, and then the percent of solar radiation captured. That really wasn't a factor difference between our high and low yield growers. So I'll wrap up here with just some of my thoughts as far as where do top yields come from? Because guys ask me, well, if I just throw more nitrogen out there, will that get me more yield? Or if I do this practice, will that get me more yield? The growers that are winning this program, there's not one practice that they are implementing on their farm. It is a combination of things. They are constantly testing products and practices and new equipment on their farm to see what response they get. And then the things that provide a positive response, they incorporate into their program. They never run their same program that they ran last year. They don't just call up their agronomist and say, hey, pull up my records from last year and apply the same fertilizer, the same fungicide, same micronutrients, and same everything. They change their program every year because they try new things to increase yields, whether it's changing row spacing or changing seeding rate. We have growers now that are putting herbicide on in the fall. If you get planted on time in the fall, you can actually get some winter annuals start to germinate, and you can control those weeds in the fall. That saves a pass in the spring because we find putting herbicide on the spring, temperatures are cold, and we can ding our wheat crop because the temperature's cold. And you know, herbicides have a range of use as far as maturity of the wheat. Once you hit the first node, there's a whole bunch of herbicides that's the end date that you can apply those herbicides. So we have growers that if they're approaching, growth stage 31, they're trying to get herbicide out there because they're like, well, I've already got the herbicide in the barn and I need to get it on. It's cold, but I'm just going to go apply it anyway. Well, then they end up dinging their yield a little bit. So it's all of these things that I think contribute to the higher yields that these farmers are getting. And it's not one thing that they do that just makes them the winner. It's a series of 6 or 8 or 10 different things that they use to ratchet that yield up over time. And it's not going to happen just overnight next year. You're just going to come in and implement all these practices and all of a sudden have a big yield. It's a series of things that you need to try on your farm to ratchet that up. So the impetus is on you to think about your management and what can you do. If you don't want to try and you're happy with where you're at, that's great. Don't worry about it. But if you want to improve your yields, you need to think about all of the different things we've talked about today and say, what can I do on my farm? What practice can I change? What can I try new to try to push these yields a little bit higher? So with that, I think I'll stop there. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
When you're applying, take the mic, please, for the recording. Take my book so I don't forget. When you're applying nitrogen with your fungicide, how are you doing it? Are you doing it with the sprayer, or are you doing like a fungicide pass and then a spreader pass? What are you doing there?
So the question is, when we're applying fungicide with our nitrogen, we generally do it in 2 separate passes. We do have a few guys that are putting humic acid with in the tank with the 28% and the fungicide, and they are spraying it on the wheat with flat fan nozzles. Otherwise, there's a few that are doing that, and I haven't tried it yet, but they're telling me that they don't get burn on the wheat when they spray nitrogen on with flat fan nozzles. That just makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck, thinking that they would do that, but they're telling me it works. So generally, those are two separate passes.
Okay. Another question, have you done any work with, we're doing a lot of work on PEI with our potato crops with SWOT mapping and whatnot to get zones in our fields to do variable rate seeding with our potato crop. Are you seeing any work with variable rate seeding in wheat or any of the other cereals?
We have a few growers, some of our high yield growers are trying variable rate seeding, but we don't know enough about it yet to know. And it depends on your philosophy, whether if you have an area that's a low yielding area for whatever reason, do you try to push management on it? And some growers will say, nope, that area yields low every year, drop seeding rate, drop nitrogen, and spend less money on it and lose less money on that area. Other people will say, no, that area can be productive. I'm going to do everything I can to try to bring it up. So it really depends on philosophy, but I don't have an answer on what should you do with seeding rates in different zones in a field yet.
Okay. I'll ask one more and then I'll sit down. Winter kill. Do you deal with winter kill much? We're trying to grow winter wheat, of course, after our potato crop, not being able to plant it till usually 1st of October, early October, sometimes late September for some guys. What's your guys' experience? You're just not an issue because of your rotation? Just wanted to ask that.
Yeah, so winter kill is an issue for us, and generally we see winter kill in the late planted wheat where guys are shallowing the planting because it's late in the season. They're trying to get it up to try to get some tillers in the fall. So when you plant that seed shallow, wheat has crown roots, just like corn does. Now, the crown roots on corn are above the soil surface. You want the crown roots on wheat to be below the soil surface, which means you got to plant 1.5 inches deep. And then that will put your crown roots at about 1 inch below the soil surface. That helps provide for anchorage to prevent frost heaving, which is one of the problems for winter kill for us. What happens is the spring freeze-thaw process, wheat will heave. The other problem we have on some of our heavier soils is when the snow melts in the spring, water will pond in the field. It'll get back below freezing, the water will freeze, and then we have ice encasement under there, and that can cause winter kill as well. So, drainage is an important, component of preventing that as well. I'm kind of out of time.
No, that's great. Any other questions, or?
Yes, sir.
Have you put the economics to any of your practices, and how is that proven out? Is throw everything, the kitchen sink at it, is it making more money or just wasting it?
It's funny you ask that question because I get that quite a bit. There's always the pessimist in the crowd that says, they look at what these high yield guys are doing. They're like, oh my Lord, look at all those applications and look at all those products and passes across the field. They're just throwing more money at it, and maybe the extra yield they're getting, they're breaking even. They're not making any money doing it. Well, we put some economics to, we didn't do a complete analysis. Look, we only looked at the input costs. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, plant growth regulator, fungicides, herbicides, and we assigned the same cost across all farms, so it didn't matter where they were from, and we calculated what the average cost per acre, and the high yield guys spent about $362 per acre. The low yield guys, so this is this top 20, bottom 20 analysis, the bottom 20, their average cost was about $320 per acre. So yeah, the high yield guys are putting on more. Now you take that cost per acre and divide it by their yield. The high yield guys were at $2.45 per bushel. The low yield guys were over $3. And when you multiply out and you do the math, plug in a price per bushel, our top 20%, our high yield guys made $379 per acre more than the low yield guys did. So I was getting the same question from growers like, oh, these high yield guys, they're throwing so much money at it. But you don't have to put the brand name products on at all of these application passes. If you can save some money with a generic fungicide or a generic product, you need to do your math and look at those different products that are available to you. But yeah, economics is very important, and you need to factor that in. That needs to be part of, you don't want to just produce high yields if you're not making more money. Good point. Okay.
I just have one quick question. At the end presentations last night, you were there, and
Yeah.
we focused a lot on pH levels here. I was just wondering in your presentation where your pH levels are and what you think that effect is.
Yeah, so we got kind of a tale of two stories on our pHs. We have some calcareous soils that have a naturally high pH, like pHs above 7.5, even approaching 8. So we can have manganese deficiency in those fields. But then maybe 10% of our yen growers are in that scenario. The rest of them, the pH, they have to add lime every year, or in their program every 3 years or whatever it is to manage those soil pHs. I had on one of the slides the range in pHs. It was like 6.2 to 8, I think, was the range in pH last year from last year's participants.
Thank you very much, Dennis.
Yeah.
I got a present for you. Appreciate that. I'll
Thank
take it
you.
around for some questions later.
Yeah, I'll be around.
Sure.